The period from 1775 to 1815 was a momentous period in American history. It opened with the American Revolution, followed by the disruptive period after the Revolution, followed by a trade embargo, the purchasing of Louisiana Purchase, and ending with the War of 1812. In between there also, we almost went to war with France. So this was a period, of course, of the writing of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, Bill of Rights. So this is the formative period of American history. What we're interested here are the economic consequences of these important political events. So let's start with the American Revolution. In 1770, as Americans had already had a number of years of organizing against English taxation, English officials, English colonial policy, even in the early 1700s, most Americans did not consider themselves, in fact, virtually all Americans did not consider themselves Americans. They wouldn't have identified themselves as Americans. They were Englishmen. When they protested, they didn't protest as Americans, they protested to protect their rights as Englishmen. Very few people thought of themselves as Americans. Some of the more radical political leaders, such as John Hancock, who was upset with English because they were interfering with his smuggling operations, and Sam Adams. The American Revolution turned English colonists into Americans. It's the birth of American nationalism, thinking about the United States. The American Revolution, as it's usually portrayed in history books and in movies, looks like a fairly tame affair. Usually it's a bunch of farmers behind bushes and rocks shooting at a few English soldiers. In reality, it was a long war with a great deal of participation. Very high percent of Americans, in fact, fought in the war. The number of Americans killed in the war was the highest percent of the population of the time of any war fought in America except for the Civil War. This was a war that went on. This was a disruptive war. Within the war between the rebels and the English, there was a number of small civil wars going on as different groups of loyalists and rebels fought each other in local areas, including places like Bergen County. It led to a great deal of animosity, as a large number of Americans supported the English, a large number of Americans, of course, fought the English. The first economic impact of the war was it created a lot of refugees. During and after the war, at least 50,000 Americans, this is out of a population of 2.3 million, at least 50,000 Americans, and probably closer to 100,000, left or were forced out of the United States. This is a tremendous out-migration. These were people who supported England, called Tories. Generally more conservative, probably somewhat wealthier than average. And what it led to was it eliminated part of the upper classes, or what passed for the upper classes in the United States. So their property was seized, it was redistributed. So this eliminated kind of a conservative level of society in the United States. Of course, the second consequence of the war was the United States, this new country, was kicked out of the English, its favored position in the English Atlantic trading system. No longer did American products enjoy a monopoly in English markets, and in fact, the English merchants went to find substitutes for such important products as tobacco. The third consequence of the American Revolution was that as part of the treaty, the United States not only became the country of the 13 colonies, but also was given the what is called the Northwest Territory, basically the Ohio River Valley. The British decided that they could not defend this from Americans land-hungry Americans who were going to stream across the Appalachian Mountains. They had enough of Americans, so that they basically conceded this large territory to American settlement. This created a huge new area for American farmers. And American farmers reacted immediately by streaming across the Appalachians to settle in the area north and south of the Ohio River. In fact, by 1815, total population had gone up to about 8.5 million. Large population increase again. But over 2 million Americans were now living west of the Appalachians. In other words, almost the same number of Americans now live west of the Appalachians as there were Americans at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. This western expansion will continue, of course, throughout the entire 19th century. It is one of the dominant themes in American history, the continually westward movement of the frontier. By 1860, just before the Civil War, almost half of all Americans lived west of the Appalachians, west of the mountains. So this began this trans-Appalachian rush to look for new, cheap lands. The westward migration was also facilitated by a number of laws that were passed right after the American Revolution that made it easier for Americans to buy cheap land and to have secure property rights. This land was owned by the federal government, and under the land ordinances, most of which were written by Thomas Jefferson, Americans could buy the land from the federal government and own the land without recourse. The federal government couldn't take it back. They weren't leasing the land. People who bought the land had secure property rights. So there were a number of economic consequences, movements that began as a consequence of the American Revolution, of the Americans winning the American Revolution. The next great political event, of course, was the writing of the Constitution. A large amount of the Constitution was written in order to establish a legal framework for the United States as a political entity and the United States as an economic entity. What the Constitution does, in fact, is to establish the legal framework for the kind of free market capitalist society that America was going to become in the 19th century. If you read the Constitution, there's a number of things in there that clauses in the Constitution that accomplish a number of important economic implications. There's a strong thrust in the Constitution to protect property rights. There's a strong thrust in the Constitution to protect contracts. The Constitution establishes an independent judiciary who will enforce contracts, who will protect property rights. The independent judiciary, under the strong leadership of John Marshall, is going to do something else in the future. Through the Interstate Commerce Clause, the Supreme Court is going to rule that states which had the power to grant monopolies to private corporations, the Supreme Court is going to rule that if there is any interstate movement at all, if there's any interstate business at all involving the monopoly, then the federal government, the laws that were passed in the Constitution, that were interpreted by the federal Supreme Court, superseded state law, and that was used, the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution was used to strike down monopolies. So by limiting the role of monopolies, the power of monopolies, the Supreme Court, using the Constitution, the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution, was going to enforce competition, was going to open up markets for new competitors. No company was going to enjoy a monopoly. And this actually, as we'll see, the test case of this was to help break the monopoly that Robert Fulton's company had on steamboats in New York. Another part of the Constitution says that only the federal government can issue money. Now, before the Constitution, states could issue money. All the colonies at one time or another, in fact, issued their own money. This created a lot of trouble. There was at least 13 kinds of money out there. In fact, there were more than 13. And doing business was complicated. But if you were paid in one kind of currency, you had to figure out what it was worth in terms of another currency. And this just added to the total cost of doing business. Federal government now had the power, the monopoly power, to make money. There was going to be one currency. There was going to be one set of laws that superseded state laws. Those laws would also apply to the new territories, so that even as Americans and American business, as economic activity continued to expand west, the same set of laws applied to everyone. It limited the federal government, again through the Supreme Court, limited the ability of states to favor their own companies. Basically, what the Constitution also says is that a state law applies not just to the companies in the state, but also can apply to other companies. In other words, there's no favoritism to local companies, even if the economic activity is just within the state. So the legal basis for the kind of economy that we're going to have in the 19th century was laid in the Constitution. The Constitution also, through Interstate Commerce Clause, through its monopoly on issuance of currency, is also going a long way into making the United States one large economic market. It's eliminating many of the transaction costs, many of this large and growing land area being divided into separate markets with separate currencies, separate laws. There are no tariffs, there are no taxes between when goods move from state to state, as there had been in the colonial period. So that this became an important set of preconditions for the United States to grow into the large economy that it did. Well, the federal government gets organized. It's very small, by the way. It has very little impact except through that everyone is obeying the laws, the rules of the Constitution. The Bill of Rights is written. Government becomes organized, and in 1807, Thomas Jefferson buys the Louisiana Purchase, which almost doubles the size of the United States. The rest of the Ohio River Valley, the Mississippi Valley, west of the Mississippi, a huge, huge land tract. He buys it for a net of $11 million from the French, one of the better bargains in history. So that America is now, in 1807, larger in territory than all of Europe. This is a massive amount of land. And Americans, again, rapidly increasing population, rapid movement west into all of this new farmland. American economy recovers from the Revolution. In the 1790s, the economy does very well. France and England are at war again, as the English are leading the coalition against the French Revolution and then against Napoleon. The United States declares neutrality and begins to supply goods and services to both sides and gets wealthy. American shippers and merchants get wealthy doing this. But finally, as the war goes on in Europe, both sides, the French under Napoleon and the English, say, look, if you're going to trade with us, you can't trade with the other guy. English ships begin seizing American ships on the high seas that they believe are headed for France or headed for Europe under the control of the French. And finally, Jefferson's had enough of this, and he gets Congress to pass an Embargo Act, also in 1807. And for the next, what the Embargo Act means is American ships basically have to stay in port. They cannot go into the high seas. This avoids confrontation with the English Navy. From 1807, 1808, until the end of the War of 1812 until 1815, America is going through a serious recession or a depression. Like, again, we don't have good numbers, so it's hard to say which one. This is a bad time economically for the United States. Trade, which had been an important engine of growth, goes way down, stops for a period, in fact, so that the American economy, except for, of course, the expansion of agriculture, is doing very, very poorly in this period. War of 1812 comes, Washington, D.C. gets burned to the ground, but the English know that America is just too big and it would be too expensive to try and reconquer it, so it's really more of a punitive war than anything else. War ends in 1815 as the wars in Europe end. Napoleon's defeated at Waterloo. Now, if we look at America in 1815, now this is 40 years after the beginning of the American Revolution. American population has gone up by almost 4 times in this period. Again, a large number of Americans are streaming across the Appalachians to settle in the Ohio River Valley, in Kentucky and Tennessee, and also beginning to move towards the lower Mississippi Valley. But if you look at the structure of the American economy in 1815, it is not at all obvious that the United States is going to become one of the great industrial powers of the 19th and 20th century. America is still overwhelmingly an agricultural country. And in fact, with the opening up of the new lands in the north, there's going to be a tremendous expansion of family farming in the north, and with the opening up of the Mississippi Valley, after Louisiana Purchase, there's going to be a tremendous expansion of slave-based cotton production, plantation agriculture in the South. A great deal of investment is going to be made in agriculture. So agriculture is expanding. This is, of course, what Jefferson had in mind, the reason he bought the Louisiana Purchase, the reason he wrote the land ordinances, is what Jefferson wanted was a predominantly agricultural country. He believed that agriculture was the foundation for a republic, that it was important that most people own land, gave them a stake in the society, gave them independence, and that was the basis for the kind of society, the kind of political structure that he foresaw for the future. Jefferson was scared of industrialization. He had seen the consequences in Europe when he was ambassador to France. He was scared of large cities, urbanization. He was scared of mobs. He was scared of industrial workers who had no property, that had depended on someone else for their livelihood. He felt that that was a danger to democracy. And that was pretty much the dominant attitude in the early 1800s, that pretty much industrialization, urbanization was bad, it was dangerous to the kind of democracy that people like Jefferson had in mind. So by giving people more land, this would extend the economic basis for the kind of society, this agrarian-based republic that Jefferson envisioned. And in 1815, Jefferson's still alive, he's not president anymore. In 1815, it looked like that's what was going to happen. That's where most of the growth was taking place in the American economy. There was very little else going on, in fact, that would lead one to conclude, lead one to bet, in fact, that America was about to begin industrializing and urbanizing. There were very few indications. Now, there were some technological advances that occurred in this period, but again, they didn't necessarily lead to industrialization. Fulton and the steamboat, 1807. Steamboats now could go up and down rivers. They could transport passengers, carry some freight, although that was somewhat limited in the early steamboats. But that didn't necessarily, steamboats by themselves were not necessarily going to lead to industrialization. In fact, steamboats were going to have a very limited role to play in the tremendous expansion of transportation services. One of the other great inventions, or important inventions of this period, was Eli Whitney's cotton gin. Eli Whitney was a Connecticut Yankee, went to Yale, was, like a lot of people in the North, was pretty good with machinery. After he graduated, one of his old roommates invited him down to visit his family down in Georgia. Whitney goes down there. They're all sitting around talking about their economic problems. And the area of Georgia he went to, which was along the coast, they grew cotton. And cotton was not a major crop. In fact, it was a rather small crop. The problem, Eli Whitney was told, was not growing the cotton. The problem was cleaning the cotton, separating the cotton fibers from the seeds. And that took a tremendous amount of time. Somebody who was very good at that could separate about a pound of cotton fiber from the seeds per day. It's a very slow, tedious process. So Whitney began thinking about it, thought for a couple of days, and he came up with the cotton gin. The cotton gin is a very simple machine, just a box with two sets of teeth, like combs. The cotton goes through, and the teeth rip the cotton fibers away from the seeds and drops it into, separates it out. This very simple machine immediately increased productivity of cleaning cotton by 7 times. Somebody operating the machine could do 7 pounds a day. Tremendous increase in productivity. It was improved upon, of course, as time went on and became much, much more productive. But the cotton gin didn't lead to the Industrial Revolution. The cotton gin just created the condition for a tremendous expansion of cotton production in the United States. Again, expanding agriculture in this society, again with tragic consequences. So if you looked at the industrial side, again, there wasn't much there that looked like we were heading towards a large industrialized economy. We had a very, very small cotton textile industry made up of small mills in Rhode Island, very backward in technology. And again, what the mills did was to process fiber. So in 1815, the philosophy, the dominant opinion was against industrialization. Most of the economic activity was in the area of agriculture. There wasn't a lot of technological innovation going on that was going to lead to industrialization. It was not obvious in 1815 that America was going to become an industrial giant. The next 2 lectures, in fact, is really going to be a theme over the next few lectures, particularly the next 2 lectures are going to discuss how America changed from being this overwhelmingly agrarian society to starting the process of economic development, starting the process of industrialization. This expansion of the territory of the United States, this rapid westward movement of the population of the United States, complicated the process of economic development. The problem was this: more and more food was being grown in the Ohio Valley, being grown west of the Appalachians. The market for that food, however, was back in the East Coast, cities of the East Coast, and for export to Europe after things, of course, settled down. America, again, virtual wilderness, very low population density because of the tremendous amount of land. Now, what this meant was for trade, what it meant for economic development was that transportation of agricultural goods was slow, was unreliable, and was very expensive. Agriculture couldn't really develop its potential in the Midwest, the upper Midwest, and in the Midwest, unless the excess produce that was being produced out there, the excess wheat, flour, animals, cows, pigs, beef, pork, unless the excess produce could in fact be sold in the more older urbanized areas of the United States, and again also exports to Europe. Now in 1815, this was virtually impossible to do. There were two ways to get, say, a barrel of flour from the Ohio River, say Cincinnati, back to, say, Philadelphia. The first way was to either try to put it on a barge and move it up the Ohio River to Pittsburgh, slow process, or to take it overland along the river in a wagon, and then once it gets to Pittsburgh to put it in a wagon pulled by 2 or 4 horses and take it to Philadelphia. This was an extremely slow process, of course. It was also extremely expensive. In fact, it was so expensive, horses eat a lot, it was so expensive that it was actually cheaper to take that same barrel of flour and put it on a barge or a keel boat to go down the Ohio River, down the Mississippi to New Orleans, take it off the barge, put it on a sailing ship in New Orleans, and then have the ship come all the way around through the Gulf of Mexico, around the tip of Florida, up the Atlantic coast, up the Delaware River to Philadelphia. It was actually faster and cheaper to do that than to take it overland back across Pennsylvania. Wagons, Americans had come up with a new kind of wagon. It was called the Conestoga wagon. It became famous later in westerns as the covered wagon. These wagons were large. They could carry a lot more freight than older wagons could. They could carry 4 tons. The biggest ones could carry as much as 8, but 4 was about the average. But despite that, despite the innovation in cargo carrying wagons, overland freight costs were very, very high. 1815, typically, to carry agricultural goods, typically the cost would be approximately 15 to 20 cents per ton mile. That is, it would cost 15 to 20 cents to move 1 ton of goods 1 mile. What that meant was that if you were a farmer back in the Pennsylvania Dutch country, around Lancaster, that if you wanted to ship wheat to Philadelphia, which was about, I believe it's 60 or 70 miles away, the transportation cost that you would have to pay would double the wholesale price of wheat in Philadelphia compared to what the price of wheat was in Lancaster. So a tremendous increase in cost. Slow, unreliable, very costly. Slow down the growth rate of the American economy. What happens after 1815 has been called the Transportation Revolution, and it's a necessary condition for America to become, a sufficient condition to become an industrial power. Without the Transportation Revolution, it's highly unlikely that America would have ever evolved too much beyond becoming a large agricultural society. The defining event, the event that really kicked it off, was the digging of the Erie Canal. After 1815, all the major ports along the Atlantic Ocean, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and to a lesser extent Charleston, South Carolina, realized that if they were going to be major urban centers, major ports, major export points, they were going to have to tap into, they were going to have some links, some ties with the area behind the cities, the hinterland, but more importantly, they were going to have some type of long-range ties with this new area west of the Appalachians. They would have to somehow convince farmers in the Ohio Valley to ship their goods to their port as opposed to one of the competing ports. How to do this? Well, the Port of New York had an advantage over the other ports, excuse me, but was also the first city to really build a link to the west, and that link was the Erie Canal. Americans for a long time wanted to build a canal through the Mohawk Valley. New Yorkers petitioned the national government for funds to build a canal. they didn't receive him, and then in desperation, the governor of New York, DeWitt Clinton, got the state of New York to commit to building the canal, to commit to put up the funds to build the canal. The state of New York, in fact, raised the money to build the Erie Canal. Now, the advantage New York had over the other ports was that the Mohawk Valley was one of the very, very few places where there was a break in the mountains, where it was relatively level, so that this canal was not going to have to go up to high elevations and then come back down to sea level or lake level on the other side. So that the geography favored building this canal across the state of New York through the Mohawk Valley. The problem was that the canal was going to go from Buffalo to Albany, a line in the famous Erie Canal song. This canal was going to be 363 miles long. Nobody in the United States had ever built anything that big. There were no canal engineers. There was a lot of canal building experience in England that Americans could go over and learn about, but nobody had really built a canal that long. But the state of New York decided that it was going to do it. And it began in 1817, and the amazing thing about this story is the state of New York succeeded. This is one of an example where a government project, in fact, met expectations, and in fact, in this case, exceeded expectations. It was obvious as early as 1819, 1820, when sections of the canal were completed and local traffic began on the canal. It was obvious early on that this canal was going to be a roaring economic success. That this canal not only would increase local traffic in New York, but this canal was going to become the major way that agricultural products went from the west to the east. Products would be shipped up to the Great Lakes. They would be put on the boats that ran on the lakes, sailing ships on the lakes. They would be brought to Buffalo, where they would be transshipped onto canal boats, which would go across New York in the Erie Canal to Albany. They would then be put on steamers or sailing boats, come down the Hudson River to New York. And what everyone began to realize by the early 1820s was New York now had a tremendous advantage over the other ports. New York was going to become the port of choice for shippers in the Midwest. The Erie Canal, being the first major canal, by the way, also became the biggest success story in canals. It carried the most cargo, it made the most profit. It was profitable longer than almost any other canal in the United States, and in fact, parts of it are still being used in upstate New York. Parts of it are now called the New York State Barge System, but again, it is still being used, at least parts of it are. So the Erie Canal was first of all an economic success, but it presented a challenge to the other ports. A challenge that if they wanted to grow, if they wanted to become more profitable, if the merchants in the ports wanted to handle more volume, become more profitable, they had to meet this challenge of the Erie Canal and New York City. It showed it could be done. You could build a canal. So this began a period of American history of canal building that lasted from the early 1820s, and it peaked in 1837. Most of the canals were either finished or at least had begun in that period. There were a number of different kinds of canals. Again, the main idea was to tap into agricultural areas, to tap into the hinterlands of these cities. Canals that were there basically to transport agricultural goods, which would also include such things as timber and lumber, wood products. It's basically what the Erie Canal did. It's what some of the other canals did. Philadelphia responded, Philadelphia being the main competing port to New York City. Philadelphia responded by eventually building a canal across Pennsylvania called the Pennsylvania Main Line Canal. That's where the Main Line section of Philadelphia gets its name. building a canal across Pennsylvania, which was the exact opposite of the Erie Canal. It was an economic disaster. It was extremely expensive. It had to go up and down a great deal more mountains than did the Erie Canal. In fact, one section of it, they couldn't even build a canal. They had to build what is called a gravity railroad, which I'll go into later on. But they had to compete. They had to have some link to the Ohio Valley, and this was their first attempt to do it. While it carried a lot of traffic, never ever anywhere near as much as the Erie Canal, is that it was an economic failure. It cost way too much to build. Its tolls were very high compared to other canals. It was somewhat unreliable because of the terrain it had to go through. So that it really didn't help Philadelphia to compete with New York. So that was one kind of canal, to tap into agricultural areas. The second kind of canal that was built were the types of canals that were built in this area, the region right around here, that were built in New Jersey, that were built in eastern Pennsylvania. And those canals were built to tap into the anthracite coal regions of eastern Pennsylvania. Now, this is something new. The fuel of choice in America was wood. We had tremendous wood resources. We used wood to build everything. We used wood as our major source of fuel, of energy, because we had this huge amounts of trees, huge amounts of forest in America. Now, in eastern Pennsylvania, it had been known for a long time, there were anthracite coal mines, but there was no real good economic reason to develop those mines. As a matter of fact, anthracite coal. Anthracite coal is very, very hard coal. It's almost pure carbon. The good news about anthracite coal is that once you get it to burn, you can get a very high steady heat off of it. There's very little ash because it's almost pure carbon. The bad news of anthracite coal is it's very difficult to ignite, to get it to start burning. And sometimes it was called stone coal because it was like burning stones. People knew there was a lot of anthracite coal, but the first problem was that it had to compete against wood, which was abundant and cheap. The second problem was that anthracite coal occurred in very narrow valleys in eastern Pennsylvania that were very, very difficult to get to, in wilderness areas. The problem wasn't so much mining the coal. The problem was getting the coal out of these narrow, steep valleys to market, getting them to Philadelphia, getting the coal to Philadelphia, getting the coal to New York. And this had to be done very quickly. This had to be done in the 1820s, as the new canals also had to be built in the 1820s, because there was anthracite coal in different valleys, and what was obvious was that the coal from different valleys was going to compete with each other. So whoever could develop coal mines in one valley and get substantial amounts of coal out of that valley would have a head start in developing markets in Philadelphia and New York. The two major early coal-producing regions that were in competition was the Lehigh Valley, Easton, Allentown, Bethlehem, Mock Chunk, and the Schuylkill Valley, west of Philadelphia, with Reading being the major town in the Schuylkill Valley. So the people who owned the coal mines in the Lehigh Valley realized what they really had to do was to build canals. And that's what they did. They first tried to improve the river. The Lehigh River, much of the time, is very shallow, lots of rocks, very dangerous to come down in a barge loaded with coal. The attempt was to improve the river, to dig channels in the river, but this didn't work very well. And what became obvious in the early 1820s to the men who owned the Lehigh Coal Company was they were going to have to build a canal. And they did. They built the Lehigh Canal, one of the earliest canals, and also one of the most successful canals. So Lehigh coal now gets to the Delaware River. The question is, how do you get it to New York? How do you get it to Philadelphia? Delaware River, some of the same problems. Some parts of it, lots of rocks, relatively shallow, kind of dangerous to float a barge down the Delaware River. So the state of Pennsylvania built a canal along the Pennsylvania side of the river called the Delaware Division Canal. Most of that canal, in fact, is still there. You can drive along it on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River. It's very pretty. You can also go for a canal boat ride in New Hope. So a lot of it is still, in fact, intact. On the New Jersey side, the idea was to build a canal to bring the coal to New York City. And that canal was the Morris Canal, which runs through Waterloo, runs through Lake Hopatcong, Dover, Denville, down through Paterson, through Bloomfield, and into Newark. Later it was expanded to Jersey City. This was going to be the major outlet for Lehigh coal going to New York City. Company in the Schuylkill Valley built the Schuylkill Canal, again to take coal out of the Schuylkill Valley. Another canal called the Delaware and Hudson was built to take coal out of northern Pennsylvania, area around Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, to take it across northern Pennsylvania and across New York to Newburgh, and then down the Hudson River to New York City. So there were three major sources of coal, all of which were exploited, could only be exploited by building canals to get the coal out of these valleys, to get them to market, to Philadelphia and New York. So another set of canals that became very, very important early on in the 1820s were the coal-carrying canals. Later on, there would be a second canal across New Jersey. The Delaware and Raritan Canal runs from Camden and Trenton through Princeton, across the center of New Jersey. Another major coal-carrying canal to get Schuylkill and Lehigh coal to New York City. So there was a number of canals being built. Eventually, over 3,000 miles of canals were built. Many of them in the Midwest particularly were built and virtually abandoned after they were built in the 1830s and 1840s because they were uneconomical and because they lost out quickly to railroads. But the Erie Canal didn't. The coal-carrying canals remained in service and continued to carry more and more coal into the 1850s, 1860s, and sometimes even beyond. Now, the canals did a number of things. What the first thing canals did is that canals were built to carry what were called bulk goods. These were goods, lot of weight, low value per pound, low value per ton. Canals were built to carry wheat, flour. They were built to carry coal. They were built to carry iron ore. They were built to carry timber. They were built to carry limestone, building materials. You could move, the idea was to be able to move a lot in terms of volume over the canals. And in fact, they were able to do that. They were able to carry tremendous quantities of agricultural goods and raw materials. That was the first thing. Great improvement over wagons and horses. The second thing was that transportation costs, this may be at least as important, probably more important, transportation costs on canals were much, much lower than they were in carrying bulk goods by wagon. Again, typically around 1820 or so, typically it cost 15 to 20 cents per ton mile to carry 1 ton of goods 1 mile. Canals, typically the cost of carrying a ton mile fell to 2 cents per ton mile. There was a 80 to 90% decrease in the cost of transportation of carrying bulk goods over long distances. This is a tremendous decrease in cost. Increased capacity, decreased cost. So it did become, markets became larger. It became more profitable to transport large amounts of coal, iron ore, agricultural goods over long distances. Tremendous fall in transportation costs. This was absolutely necessary if the United States was going to economically develop. It's this reduction in transportation costs. Now, the second thing that happened, beginning in 1830, well, actually a little bit earlier than that, but really beginning in 1830, the second thing that happened almost simultaneously with this tremendous amount of canal building that's going on is interest in railroads. The first real railroad was built in England, the Stockton and Darlington Railroad, which started in 1825. It was, by modern standards, a very, very primitive affair. And a number of American cities, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Charleston, and Boston, not Boston, the first three, who were looking at how to expand their economic territory west, had to confront this question of, do we build a canal or do we build a railroad? Philadelphia particularly was faced with this dilemma. So what they did in 1825 is they sent an engineer to England to take a look at the Stockton and Darlington Railroad. He came back and said basically that the engines are too small, they'll never get up and down the hills of Pennsylvania, and he recommended they build a canal. It turned out that was also good political advice, because most of the people had already decided back in Philadelphia to build a canal. So he knew who was paying his salary, or his consulting fees in this case. So Philadelphia opts to build a canal, get it underway, not to wait for the development of railroad technology. Baltimore, on the other hand, starts a little bit later, and the merchants of Baltimore are not quite as sure of which way to go. So what they end up doing is funding both the canal, the Chesapeake and Ohio, and a railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio. They start in 1828. The railroad really starts, 15-mile section of it begins in 1830, and by 1830, there had been tremendous improvements in railroad technology in England. In 1830, the first real modern railroad came into operation in England, the Liverpool and Manchester Railroad. And this created tremendous excitement among merchants and railroad enthusiasts in the United States. People went over to England to take a look at this railroad. Most of the improvements in the railroad were engineered by one company in England, George Stephenson and Sons, who had built a much better locomotive. This locomotive was larger, had more pulling capacity, could carry larger trains, and it looked like, in fact, it was the locomotive that could be used to carry large amounts of freight rather than the kind of very light trains and passenger trains. So Baltimore, by the time they developed the railroad, had this improved technology available. And so they decided to use it. And so that the first locomotives that were put on the tracks in the United States were imported from England. They were considered to be the standard by which Americans would judge domestic production of locomotives. What's amazing about this story, and again, it's an indication of what makes the United States kind of unique, was that what became obvious for a great number of economic and technological reasons, what became obvious to investors and builders of railroads, that English locomotives, English trains, the English way of building a railroad was not the best way to do it for the conditions in the United States. England topography was different. England was a relatively flat country. Hills were kind of small. America was the opposite. America had mountain ranges. America had a lot of hostile environment in terms of fast-flowing rivers that had to be forged, or tunnel of bridges or viaducts had to be built over them. And in that kind of environment is that the way the English built railroads just didn't make a whole lot of technological and economic sense to Americans. English built very straight railroads over flat ground, and they built them to last. granite roadbed, lots of iron in the building of the railroad. The rails were made out of iron. They were sitting in iron seats over this granite. Very kind of stable sort of railroad. The locomotives were also very, very well built. They tended to be big, they tended to be heavy, they tended to be rigid, a lot of pulling power over, again, because they were going to be running over fairly straight track on fairly level ground. English railroads cost a lot of money to build. Now, in the United States, the situation was just the opposite. American companies didn't have the kind of capital to invest in railroads that the English did. So Americans had to put up railroads that were not as well built, but were cheaper per mile to build. And that's what we did. We first started with English technology, granite roadbeds. But very quickly, what became obvious to American engineers was the way to build a railroad was to build it basically the way we build it today, is throw up an embankment of dirt, put some gravel over it, put wood ties down instead of granite. You could, obviously America had a lot of wood, also you could get it up and you could lay the track a lot faster, and then run track right on the wood ties. Some of the early track was actually wood with iron strips on the top, but as time went on, of course, they were replaced by iron rails. American track was different because John Stevens in Hoboken had designed a whole new track that was not typical in England, but was used in the United States. Again, a tremendous technological innovation, the T-rail, the kind of rail we still see today in all the world's railroads. Americans didn't have the time or the money to do what the English did, which would be to tunnel through hills rather than go around them, which was more difficult to do, but less expensive. American railroads had tighter turns. They had a lot more turns than English railroads did. And this was dangerous. This turned out to be a real problem because if you put an English locomotive on a railroad that was lightly built to start with, so it's bouncing to start with, and then you ask this locomotive, which is very rigid and very heavy, with rigid axles, to go around the tight turn, what you're really risking here is, of course, that the locomotive and the train is going to fall off the tracks. And that was very common, putting English locomotives on American tracks. So American engineers had to adapt the English locomotives to American conditions. And very early on, in 1830 and 1831, Americans began to build American-type locomotives, the key technology. American locomotives were lighter. They were certainly not as rigid as English locomotives. They had a lot more give to it. But the big technological change, improvement, was that American engineers added a separate set of wheels in the front of the locomotives. They're called swivel trucks or bogies, a lot of different names. And the set of wheels, the leading wheels, were not driving wheels. They were not connected to the cylinders that drove the train. But the wheels in front of the locomotive were there to steer the locomotive around turns. They were on flexible axles. They weren't as rigid as the driving wheels, and they could get these lighter locomotives, these lighter trains, around turns without having the whole thing flip over. Adaptations. Another small difference that's obvious to, if you look at American trains versus English trains, another obvious difference is American trains have those cow catchers in the front to push animals off the track. English trains don't. The reason? The English, when they built trains, they built fences along the track to keep the animals off the track. Americans just couldn't do that. It was just too expensive. Instead, they just put these cow catchers on the front just to push the animals off the track. So early on, in the first 2 years, Americans were innovating. They were building American railroads and American rolling stock to American specifications. Again, compared to England, American railroads were not as well built as ships were in the colonial time, were not as well built, but they were put up faster, they were put up cheaper. They then re-engineered the rolling stock to fit that kind of environment so that the trains would be efficient. And this allowed American railroads to become more competitive earlier on than if they had stuck to the English model. It didn't really cost that much less to ship by rail than it did by canal in the first couple decades. Particularly, in fact, it was cost a little bit more if you shipped bulk goods. But railroads, of course, could go places canals couldn't. Railroads were more reliable. They generally ran year-round. Canals could not run in the winter months because the canals would freeze. They had to drain the canals, keep the water out. So railroads had a number of other advantages. They, of course, were also a great deal faster. So for goods and other products where time was important, you would ship by rail because of the time, the value of time. Railroads competed against canals, but because railroads could continue to innovate, engines got more powerful, trains got longer, cars got bigger, you could carry more goods per train, you could carry them faster as the systems became more efficient, as the railroads were rebuilt with better equipment, with better track, is that railroad technology continued to advance. Cost per ton mile continued to come down. Railroads became more reliable. And over time, it was the fact that railroads could become more productive. There could be technological innovation in railroads and much less so in canals that over time gave railroads a competitive, a cost advantage over canals. And more of the increase in the shipment of bulk goods was going on in the railroads. A lower percent of the shipment of bulk goods was going by canal, although canals continue to have an important function, particularly carrying coal. So railroad was going to be the technology of the future because it was expandable. It could carry substantially more goods than could canals, especially over wider and wider areas, as time becomes more and more important. So by 1860, the United States has a very large and complex transportation network. Steamboats, plank roads, canals, railroads. To show how important railroads were is that railroads began in the 1830s. By 1840, there are 3,000 miles of track in the United States. By 1860, there's 30,000 miles of track in the United States. The United States had more railroad track in 1860 than England, France, Germany combined. Necessary because of the large size of America, a necessary precondition for industrialization over this wide area.